Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to the Four Pillars of Self Mastery daily live event. Today, I'll be starting with 7 performance areas, which is the knowledge pillar, and then I'll cover the next 3 pillars contextualized by the 7 step, or I should say, within the 7 step reset. So the 7 step reset breaks down those different pieces that are going on, but because they're so dynamic and and are interdependent, by looking at it as steps, we'll be able to understand them better rather than looking at pillar to pillar to pillar because they are so interdependent. Now, as far as the format today, I'll spend a little bit of overview to connect the dots on the 7 performance areas because that's the knowledge part of the knowledge pillar, and then I'll go into a little bit more depth in each one over the next 7 or 8 days: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, relationships, professional, and financial. And through that, I'll we'll be able to create a common language so that as we bring things up, especially if people are coming online and joining me on stage, we have a common language and kind of understand what we're looking for and what we're seeing. As a matter of fact, what I'll do is bring that, I'll put that chat in the comments or that link in the comments. And I noticed, I think that in some countries, this may be blocked. You may need a VPN in some countries because for whatever reason, right? So anyway, just realize you may not be able to come online, but there's the other things that we can do. We can talk offline and then link together through the internet using streaming, and we can do a separate session. Or I can just plan on having you on there from the beginning, so you're not trying to go through the restream link. So today we're going to talk about how I approach it when a person knows they're committed, they know they want more, but they're not sure where to start. That's where I'll start today and talk about some of the things that I look for and that I go through. So the first thing that happens is, first of all, recognize that the map is not the territory. What we see is not all of what actually is. So if you walk into a party and excuse me, there's multiple rooms. Each room has groups of people. There's corners, things going on. There's a bar in a couple of the rooms. And you go to this party and you're with 5 of your friends. And each of you kind of spread out and you're in different places. You can see in the car going home how you all had a different representation of that party, a different version of what was going on in that party. And that's life. When you consider that the network of neurons is always looking out at what's going on and it's filtering through to us what it thinks is important. So even if you're 2 people in the same room looking into the same corner, one person will see one set and another person will see a different set. This is, I think, why people say there's different timelines. It's not different timelines. It's all the same timeline. It's just that the network of neurons is so fast and it's processing at a ridiculously high speed, multiple times over what the conscious mind can perceive. And so the reticular activating system literally filters, and everyone has experienced this. If you've purchased a car, remember before you bought the car, you didn't see many of them. And if somebody said, what percentage of the cars are X, you would have a very low percentage, which is why you're buying it, perhaps because it's unique, exclusive, whatever. And you put down, oh, 2% maybe. And then after you buy the car, it's like they're all over the place. You feel like it's 10%, but it's not 10%. It wasn't 2% and it wasn't 10%. It was somewhere in the middle. But you went from not processing for them or filtering for them to filtering for them. And that's the range of what people can see. And it's all the same reality. It didn't change. Reality didn't change. It's your perception. So that's an important step. And I start when I'm talking to a person, that's always going on in the back of my mind. So what I'm doing is in a conversation, I do what I call going meta. I like to be up here looking down at the two people having the conversation and to observe what's going on. So it's not just me having the conversation, it's what's going on and what shifts are happening. Now, usually there are blockages, and I talk about empowerment catalysts and resistance factors. People are walking around with dozens and dozens of resistance factors, and right now in the U.S. and around the world, because there's so much going on. I'm recording this on January 12th. It's live, but today is January 12th. And just think about what's going on. You got stuff going on in Iran. You got stuff going on in the U.S. You've got uh, and Ray Dalio, and in his Changing World Order, he talks about five wars. There's technology wars. We're seeing that with countries competing and companies competing on around artificial intelligence. But when he's talking about these five wars, he's talking about with country to country. So there's chips, conversations about chips. There's this race to the top in terms of artificial intelligence. Which countries are going to get the lead? Then you have uh, geopolitical wars, and you see that happening. I mean, invading this country, talking about invading that country. This country doesn't like what that country's doing. This country's going to step up. Then we have trade wars. That's been going on for a while now. Tariffs and different trade agreements, and this country is not going to trade with that country. So you got trade wars going on, and then you have capital wars. So we see there's two major currencies. The British pound was the the world dominant currency up until around 1944, and that's when this current economic cycle began. And these cycles are actually are the same as the world superpower cycles because it has to do with the country's currency becoming the reserve currency. So the US dollar moved into the world reserve currency. The US moved into the superpower state in 1944. And so we are now, this is about 80 years, we are now in the final stages. There's six stages. We've left stage four, I'm pretty sure. We're in stage five, and stage five is a lot of conflict and turmoil. And just to put it in perspective, if you haven't seen this, and I do encourage you to go take a look at Ray Dalio's videos on the Changing World Order. And the Changing World Order, so if you look at it zoomed out, you had the Dutch was the world superpower, then Great Britain was the world superpower, and then the United States has been the world superpower for the last 80 years. And these are approximately 80-year cycles. Now, they go on well before that, but most of the ones that he talks about in his books have to do with China because China had so many different empires, and he was able to see this pattern over the last hundreds of years repeat and repeat over and over, even though we're in different time and place. He says it still repeats. It's really interesting, and a lot of human nature is fractal, so it doesn't surprise me. So this would be Dutch, this would be Great Britain, and this would be U.S. And now there's an emerging one that's coming up because as this one is going down, there's an emerging one. Now, what happens is we don't know what's going to happen with this line. What we do know is that there are five stages of in this cycle. And I am not going to go through you could check the book. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. And we've left 4. We were leaving stage 4 and moving into stage 5 somewhere around the pandemic time. So we were ending stage 4 somewhere around the early 20s. And now we're in stage 5, and there's a lot of conflict going on. This is why he's talking. This is why I bring up the five wars. So what did I say? Technology, geopolitical, trade, capital, and then there's military wars. And then within the country, you have the cultural wars going on, and that's where you're seeing some of the division in the United States and even in Europe. There's division, so you have cultural wars going on. But the reason this is important is because it it's useful to identify what is the territory or the map. What is the map that the person is walking around with? If you agree that the map is not the territory, then it also makes sense to understand what's their map, what's their model of the world. And so I do ask questions to understand that. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing on two sides of a continuum. I'm bracketing them. So in artillery and mortars, this is back before we had the technology that can laser point on a target. We had what was called a forward observer. And this forward observer would be able to see the enemy target. And then way back in the rear, you would have the artillery or the mortar rounds being shot to that target. And what they would say is they would give degrees, shift this way so many degrees and add this much distance, and then shift this way so many degrees and reduce the distance by this much. And they're bracketing, they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so what I'm doing is, in terms of looking at what's this person's model of the world, it's sort of like going from, if this is the continuum, I'm saying, well, do they believe this and that thing? They do. Okay, good. Do they believe this and that thing? Well, if they believe this and they believe that, then they probably believe this. Oh, they do believe that. Okay, so if they believe that, then they probably believe this. And then if they believe this, and this, then they're probably believing this. And if they believe that, then they believe this. And then in artillery, so this is like bracketing and then fire for effect. So they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, fire for effect. So I go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and then I lock in for now. I lock in for the next few weeks, so to speak, of who, what their identity is, what's their model of the world. And from this position, I've taken out a lot of noise because everything goes through that filter. Now, I stay open to the possibility that I'm wrong. So I'm always looking for what for the my own cognitive dissonance. Where is it breaking down? But I'll come back here and I'll reaffirm with them that this is who they are and that's their model of the world. Now they don't realize I'm doing this, and you can, as a leader, the reason I'm going down this path is because as a leader, you can also do this with your team. I recommend having an early onboarding session with your team members to understand who they are and and their model of the world, because you're going to use that later on when we talk about intrinsic motivation, because the more you can align your request or the work you're doing with what their model of the world is and what they're interested in, the more likely you're going to have intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation goes much farther than extrinsic motivation. People always leave money on the table who are either commissioned or bonus. They always leave money on the table because extrinsic motivation only does but so much. Some sophisticated approaches will take multiples of those top awards. So they'll have an award, and then they'll have a winner's award or a leader's award, and then they'll have an inner circle award, and then they'll have a chairman's award. And this is a way to tap into more and more and more of that extrinsic motivation. But at the end of the day, intrinsic motivation is still more powerful than that. And understanding who a person is at their core, their identity inside, what's their inner identity, you can organize the work in such a way and frame the work in such a way that it taps into their autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which are the pillars of intrinsic motivation, self-determination theory, and intrinsic motivation. Now that's the once I understand where they are, then, as I said, this person wants more. They've already decided that they have to have more. So I'm not working with people who just don't know what they want to do and they're happy where they are or they're happy with something different. We need to get to the point where there's something that you want and you want it bad enough that you're at least willing to contemplate crawling over broken glass. You may not be ready to crawl over broken glass yet, and that's fine. The next step is to, I've got to find a way to frame this thing so that broken glass is actually in the realm of possibility. And the way I do that is by asking questions about purpose. Now, most people will tell you, "Oh, I don't have a purpose. I don't know what my purpose is," and the eyes glass over, and they're like, "Purpose? I don't know." So what I'll do is I'll ask. First of all, I ask them to suspend judgment. We're just exploring. It's just a conversation. They're not locking anything in. We're not going to hold them to account for it, but we have to kind of just play this little game to understand what's off the table. And then, so I've created some context of why I'll do it. Then I'll ask a question. So, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? What would you do professionally if you knew that you couldn't fail? And they'll have an answer. And then I might ask some follow-up questions depending on that what that one was, because sometimes you go, it's like really loosey goosey, or sometimes it's really like specific. And so that will influence my follow-up question. But the follow-up question is something like, interesting. What would you do from just pure achievement or interest or accomplishment perspective if you knew you couldn't fail? What's out there for you? And here's what I'm trying to look at for their passion and their purpose. I want to understand their passion and purpose. Then I might ask a question like, if you didn't have to work, if there wasn't a need for you to work, what would you do professionally? I wouldn't do anything. I would just sit on the beach. Got it. And if you didn't need money, if you had all the money you needed, you didn't need money anymore, you didn't have to work, then what would you do with your time? And sometimes you get the same answer, but it doesn't matter. Again, what I'm doing is understanding who they are. And I recommend as leaders that you have the same conversation with your team members. Two major things happen. One is you probably are asking them questions that many of them have never answered before, or certainly haven't answered more than 2 or 3 times. Second thing that happens is you're calibrating how they communicate to you when they're calm and have agency and are safe. That's very important. You want to lock that in, because when they are unsafe, there's a tell. Something shifts. You can't tell why they're unsafe, but you can certainly tell that they're not comfortable right now. It could be personal. It could be something health wise. It could be something that happened weeks ago. It could be something that they're thinking about tomorrow. You don't know that. But what you do know is that whatever message you were planning on giving them, you're probably not going to want to give it to them right now. You want to check in and see where they are. So that calibration, it's difficult to do outside of this kind of onboarding meeting where you're talking about what's important to them. And yeah, I know in work, you shouldn't be talking about their personal goals, but trust me, most of the people will not leave and start their own business. Most of the people will not pursue their purpose. It takes a lot of work, and there's so many off ramps on the way to doing that. You don't have to worry about that, in my view. But by understanding what's really important to them, it helps you organize the work. And who knows, if they're with the organization long enough and you grow the organization scales to a point, they may need to offload some work, outsource it, and this person might be able to become that independent contractor. And I'm way ahead of myself, but you understand the importance of this onboarding meeting. I think leaders sleep on this. They think that onboarding is a HR function, and that when they show up, they're supposed to know how to do the work. As an aside, there's a dynamic that I see all the time. So if you go to a doctor's office or a dentist's office, when they hire a hygienist or an assistant, whatever, those people are trained. They went to school and they all trained and they learned out of the same book. I've been around long enough, decades going to the dentist, and it really hasn't changed. The technology they're using has changed, but their conversation has moved slightly, not big. The reason is because there's a foundational curriculum that they have. Leaders and marketers don't have that. Leaders and marketers show up and it's whatever they learned before. And what they learned before had a lot to do with who they worked for. So this idea of them having the skills, I think you need to get rid of that if you're not in a dentist or doctor's office or some discipline like that. You want to understand. And here's the other thing: leaders and company owners, they often select a metaphor unintentionally from what they're going to operate out of. they're going to operate like a family metaphor. It may just slip into it. They keep saying, "Oh, we're like a family." That makes sense when you have three people to say that. I never would say we're like a family because it creates all kinds of problems. Others think in their terms they're going to be command and control, or like they have the military experience. That was me coming out of the army as a captain, airborne ranger, and all that. I was like, yeah, I got into sales, and I was, yeah, this is the way we're going to do it. Is all command and control, and you learn that that doesn't work. And then other people have watched politics all their life, and they believe you got to have two camps, and it's always you got to always have this internal fight going on, and that turns into openly saying that these two pillars, the leaders of these two pillars, are competing for the next promotion, and that leads to some other problems. So different people, leaders, owners, managers, create their own paradigm, and oftentimes a company will have multiple paradigms going on or metaphors going on in their company, and then that's going to lead to toxicity. Another one might have the one I've seen start showing up in the 2000s was the friend group metaphor. It's like they get all their friends together because that's the people who are going to be with them during this founding. And then those friends, that forms a culture, and it's a friend thing, and you bring other people into it and creates problems. So the metaphor I use is team, and that's when I drew that changing world order. The reason I do that is because that's my backdrop. When I look at anything going on, that's an 80-year cycle. So I pretty much know that we're going to have reversion to the mean, that there's principles associated with that changing world order. And I don't have to get on the roller coaster every single day and take this route. I'm staying on the platform, watching the roller coaster, knowing it's coming back to the platform is how I view it. And by using that changing world order as a model, not necessarily who's going to emerge, but who's leaving, right? Who's exiting from that world superpower position, and what does that mean? Because when that happens, the the board gets changed, and things get juggled, and you have countries emerging as players because they're aligned with maybe a strength that's coming up, and you have players who are now challenging that superpower because they didn't like being in the position they were in anyway. And now that they see the weakness, they're going after it. This is fractal. You can look at this happening in neighborhoods. You can look at it happening in teams. It's human nature, and that's why I like it. It ties in human nature, and then it ties in the world view. And when people say, "Oh, this is going on, and crypto's doing that, and this is happening," those things may be true, but I look at it in the context of what's the 80-year cycle. Where are we on that 80-year cycle? And it's interesting when you look at that, you see some really scary things. Like I'm seeing ads for financial trading that were out there in 2000, in the late 90s, as we were moving away from the market maker concept into electronic trading. And these guys were looking at for new ways to make money. That was in early 2000s. By 2011, 12, 13, it was clear that the computers were doing the trading, so much so that there was a race to get closer and closer to the exchanges to reduce the latency, because trades were happening in many, many times per second to do things in the market. And I made a decision at that time that it's impossible to make a living trading, because the machines can do all sorts of things. I remember Google drop 20% in a second overnight, and because these things trade around the world, right? They trade around the clock, and it took out all these stops, and some people lost so much money, and it's like it went down there for less than a minute, bam, and then came back up, and all these stops got wiped out. And of course, when the stop gets wiped out, you're taking a loss, so you lost money because you were sleeping, and then the market comes back up, and it's like, what happened? But you have to go in and look at the overnight trading to see what happened then, especially when futures, because futures are, you're more exposed to that. But it happens in currencies, it happens in everything. So now that's why I say it's interesting to see, oh yeah, you can make a living trading, and don't come for me. This is my experience. People saying you can make ads out there, you can make a living trading and you can trade options and all these things. And I feel bad because that horse has left the barn, in my opinion. So, so this is all about getting an understanding of where a person is mentally, and then having my stabilized backdrop of what's going on in the world. Now you can challenge me on my backdrop, all that stuff. I've been around for a while. I've looked at different things. I've looked at models. I like the changing world order model because it resonates with me. And if I need to look at something different, I'll look at a demographic model because demographics. If you look at baby boomers, there's been a strong pattern as the baby boomer group went through their 20s and 30s, 40s, and as we go into the 50s and 60s and 70s, and it's still driving political decisions. It's still driving global decisions because this group is so powerful and it has a big, big impact on what goes on. So people are paying attention to. Of course, it's getting small, and then you have the Gen X behind it, which is a very small generation, and then you have the millennials. One other thing I'll talk about uh, is when you look at Gen X and Boomers, we lived face to face. Our entire world was face to face. We had no online. There were no bots. You saw what you saw and you got what you got. And you you sort of do this ongoing calibration because you need it for survival. Especially, I grew up in New York City, and you could walk from neighborhood to neighborhood, and these neighborhoods have very different uh, personalities, if you will, or experiences. So I grew up near where 50 Cent did. He was in South Jamaica. I was in Queens. And if you look at the map, those are all connected, but they're all very different to my point. It was Bricktown in South Jamaica, and that had a personality. I grew up in an area where a lot of the great musicians from the past. So this would have been in the 60s, right? And a lot of great musicians. And I think that's why that whole area of Queens generated so many artists. Plus, there's a lot of people, but I think they generated a lot of artists because there were so many musicians from from the past living in that area. So anyway, back to New York and these different personalities, the Gen X and boomers, we saw that real time. We had to experience it. We had to navigate it to survive. And then you can see the behavior showing up online. So when I look at a thread in a after a post and I look at the comments, it's very easy to spot. I can't do it all the time. It's very easy to spot the bots because you know how people interact in real life. And then you can extrapolate what that looks like online. And you recognize that some people went, sort of underground and they're keyboard warriors, but still you've seen the personalities out there in real life, and you get this norm, and that norm has shifted. It's shifted quite a bit. So the reason this is important from a boomer and an Xer standpoint is these two are similar because we both grew up offline. Then you have the millennials, and the millennials in their early stages. So you have some of the millennials early on. They had games like Atari and Game Boy and Nintendo, and they were able to beat adults. And this was really interesting because you had 2 and 3 year olds beating adults in video games. Imagine what that does to their psyche. And if you look at the first up to about 30 years of millennials, they were chest thumping. It was the chest thumping generation because they knew they were smart. They knew they could do better than anybody else. And then what happened, reality set in. The prefrontal cortex finished forming at age about 27. By 35, they're doing everything by habit. Their willpower goes away, their discipline goes away, and they realize, oh, I've got gaps. And then you have the Gen Z coming along and they're seeing that. So you can go on and on. I don't want to make this all about demographics, but if you look at the demographics and you recognize that, okay, the boomers and the Xers are pulling out, but I would say the Xers are probably more like boomers than they are like millennials. So in my demographic view, I extend the boomer generation to include the Xers, and the Xers went to something like 1980. So call it 1965 to about 1980. And by looking at it that way, you can gauge what shifts are likely coming. Because I want to know, is this an overnight shift or is this a trend change? And most of the time, it's just an overnight blip. It's not a trend change. So again, demographics and changing world order, those two are constant. and and then you recognize that because we already are having these five different wars: technology, geopolitical, trade, capital, and military. These wars are already going on around the world. there's always this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So people are on edge. And this is why I start with what's the territory, looking at the map of the territory. So that's the backdrop. I'm going to stop there because I could continue down that path. And tomorrow, what I want to do is focus on the 7 performance areas. Tomorrow, I'll focus on the 7 performance areas and how I use that as not just a roadmap, but also a diagnostic. So there are things I'm looking for, and this happens. So let's say we're doing a 90-day transformation. In the first couple of weeks, I want to get through uh, at least one cycle of this. We're going to get through perhaps this side in the first day. I want to understand where they are mentally, physically, spiritually, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But you can see I'm looking at a roadmap. This is going on in the back of my mind to see what might be the weak link here. So remember, this is the agency side: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional is what we're in control of. And then the relationship, professional, financial has to do with their quest. What are they going after? What's important to them? Why are they doing all this? And that's going to come, that's on a back seat. I'm not really worried about this too much. I have an idea because of the questions I've asked. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail, et cetera, and why? And there's one thing I didn't mention when I'm looking at that, at them, the model of the world, and it probably doesn't come right off the bat because I have to have some trust with them. They have to know that they're in a safe space in this conversation, et cetera. But I do like to go through the question why, and I'll start with the question why 3 times, and I'll eventually get to 7 times. So why is that important? Interesting. What is it that's causing you to do this instead of that? Because I have the backdrop of their model of the world, and so I'm able to interject ideas and concepts to see why. And I'm not pushing my model. I want to understand theirs. Why? Because the majority of a person's habits, which are associations, are coming from inside. They're not responding to external. The external is the initial stimulus, but once a person is off and running, those, especially, and we're talking about more anxiety and more stress and things like that, those associations are coming from inside. That so an anxiety spiral, it's not like they're getting a stimulus that freaks them out, and then another one that freaks them out, and another one that freaks them out, and another one that freaks them out 3 or 4 a second. That's not what's happening. They get one thing that freaks them out, and then there's associations made, and then those associations create another association that creates another association. So we got 100 billion neurons interacting with each other, up to as much as 10,000 other neurons. So there's trillions of connections, and these connections just keep coming online as your fear goes up. Neuroscientists will talk about this is the sympathetic nervous system kicking in. It's a fight or flight. And then you've got to get the parasympathetic nervous system to come back and play. How do you do that? That's why I use things like the 7-step reset, because I want to take those constructs and turn them into elements that people can control. And what we need to do is get some space between the network of neurons and the associations and who I am right now. So you can't suppress that once it's off and running because it's life and death. But what you can do is slow down what's coming, especially if you recognize that what's coming is from the inside. So slowing down doesn't have a threat. Remember, the reason why you're in the sympathetic mode is because there's a threat, and we the subconscious perceives that threat like a Serengeti tiger, and so the speed is important. But when you recognize that the additional stimulus or stimuli coming from inside, it doesn't matter if you slow down because it's coming from inside. It's not like there's a threat out there that's going to hurt you. So you slow down, and when you slow down what's coming in, it gives you a chance to get centered again. Eventually, and I say eventually, it's not even, sometimes it's not even weeks. I can get this slowed down in the first couple of days. Worst case scenario is I get it slowed down for normal stuff within 3 weeks. But what I've noticed is that there are then pop outs that come later. And more recently, I noticed this relapse happens because they get over here and there's a relationship situation that opened up a past wound and they get knocked off course. So that's why the fourth pillar is forgiveness, because we've got to forgive ourselves and forgive others so there's no open wounds. And that locks in this agency across the entire model: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, relationships, professional, financial. So I start here. This is all my knowledge pillar. And tomorrow I'll start with some of the things that I do in the mental, physical, spiritual area, and then eventually I'll get to emotional, and then this will be over like the next 7 to 10 days. I'll be doing each one of these. All right, so tomorrow we'll be doing 7 o'clock again. So probably for the rest of January and February, I'll go at 7 o'clock. That gives me a chance to get out on the slopes the days that I plan to ski. All right, we'll see you next time.